Today I'm going to be installing coilovers on a 997.1 911 Carrera. This is a 2006 model. It does have PASM, but I will be deleting it. I've chosen to go with BC Racing coilovers. I've already completed the driver's side, so here's a small comparison of the different parts. I've decided to start on the back of the car first. This is a fairly easy DIY project if you have any familiarity with suspension systems. If you've never done anything like this before, you might want to consider taking it to a professional, but if you are used to working on cars, then this is relatively easy. I'm going to remove these bolts here, this bolt, the sway bar end link, as well as the strut mount itself. Okay, I've got a couple of the bolts loosened here. What you'll find is once you loosen this bolt, you're not able to actually remove it because it'll hit this arm. That's the reason that we've decided to remove this bolt and this bolt. Once they're pulled out of there, it'll allow the suspension to pivot just enough to where you can pull this out without having to break this ball joint or risk damaging it. One other thing I'm going to loosen is the actual sway bar mount here. Reason being is once the strut itself is loose, I can pull it out of the way and drop it right out of there. Now inside of the car, what I'm going to do is remove these 3 bolts here, but first I'll have to disconnect the PASM wire. Once that's disconnected, it'll all just slide out of there as a unit. Also found out that I'll have to remove this bracket here. This is for the Bose subwoofer mount. It's held on by 2 10mm bolts. It's blocking access to the last strut mount bolt. So I'm going to go ahead and remove it to avoid bending it. The PASM wire is held together by this little slip-on connector. I'm just going to use a small screwdriver to pop it apart and pull it into 2 pieces. Once disconnected, it'll look like this, and then we can get to removing these 3 strut top mount bolts. I was able to get away with only loosening the first bolt on this one, and I could swing it out of the way to loosen the bolts. Didn't take them all the way off just yet because I want the strut to drop down and make sure everything is lined up so it doesn't rip the PASM wire. So now I'll be able to remove these bolts and everything should drop down. I'll be able to remove the bottom of the strut and it should drop right out of there. Okay, this is what I was trying to describe earlier. As you can see with these 2 arms out of the way, you can pivot everything up to allow you to pull out the bottom bolt there. Okay, now everything is free. So what you'll want to do is just kind of rock it a little bit. It'll move itself off of this bracket here, and then you'll be able to loosen the bolts on the top the rest of the way, and then it should drop out as a unit. Once you get it free, and it might take a little bit of force, but it shouldn't be too bad. You can push it forward here, tilt this up just a little bit, and you'll be able to wiggle it out of there. So the next step is going to be to loosen the top bolts the rest of the way and drop it right out. Side by side with the new unit. You can see on the stock unit that it has a tab that always faces out, so you'll want to make sure that this is at the correct angle when you install it. But it should line up. There shouldn't be any other way for it to go in, but just to be safe, it's easier to get it in there right the first time. One nice thing about the coilover assembly is it's quite a bit shorter than the stock unit, so it's much easier to reinstall than it is to take the original one out. What you'll want to do is the first bolt you'll put in will be the bottom strut mount. That's because you need to tilt this slightly to get around this arm again. So we'll go ahead and put this in. Okay, I've got the new coilover in. Haven't tightened the top. I'm going to compress the suspension before I do that. Next, we'll just reassemble everything that we removed, and the back will be done. I've gone ahead and compressed the suspension some. I just used a jack and lowered the car a little bit on it to put some pressure into the suspension itself. Went ahead and torqued everything down, and the rear is done. Okay, next up we have the front. The front is a little more complex than the rear of the car, but it's not too bad. On this one, we will have to remove the brake caliper, but we will not have to disconnect the line. I've seen some things online that suggest removing it, but in my opinion, it's easier just to remove the brake caliper itself and suspend it properly. You don't want to let it hang. Beyond that, we'll need to disconnect these two lines here, which I believe one is for maybe the ABS sensor and the other looks like possibly for the brake pad wear sensor. We'll need to remove this bracket as well as one small one on the back. After that, we'll remove the sway bar end link itself, the three top hat nuts, and it'll drop out of here as a unit. And to remove this one here, we just pop up this metal bracket. These will each pop out. They're just held in by a compression fit, and then of course this locks them down. The caliper itself is very easy to remove. It's got a hex bit, 10 millimeters. Then you simply remove both of them. The caliper will slide right off. Okay, the idea here is just to suspend the brake caliper. You don't want to let it hang from this cable because it could stretch it. Some people will use a zip tie. I just put it on a jack stand to hold it up. Okay, the next step we'll do is we'll remove this bolt. We've already removed everything else. Once we have the top hat up, we should be good to go. One other thing to mention, there is another bolt right here that holds the bottom of the control arm. I'm not sure if you can see it, but this one will need to be loosened but not removed. That will allow everything to swing down enough to pull it out. And just like the back, we're going to loosen these three nuts. I'm not going to take them all the way out yet because I don't want it to fall down before I want it to. And then don't forget to disconnect your PASM line. Next up, I've put a little tape around the fender lip because when we pull this out, there is a small chance it could contact it. So better safe than sorry. It probably won't be needed, but I would recommend trying to protect your fender in some way. I'll probably put a small towel over the top of the strut as well when I pull it out, just to be safe. So I've removed the sway bar end link. It won't quite come out yet, but once I get it pulled down, it should pull out of there. The bottom is disconnected. I've loosened the bolt on the bottom as well, so I should be able just to pull this assembly out without much issue. I was able to pull it out of there with not much issue. I have it resting on a jack stand just to hold everything upright. So next I'll pull the strut out and replace it with the coilover. front is just about done. All I have to do is get the top bolts lined up, tighten them down, tighten all the fasteners that I loosened, and I should be good to go. Okay, the front is now done. I've left the BC kit exactly as it was from the kit. I'll see how it sits once I put it down, and I can make my adjustments from there. It's pretty simple to adjust. You just loosen the lock collar, and then you can thread the coilover into or out of the shock to either lift or lower the car. I haven't adjusted the coilovers at all, but this is exactly how they came from BC Racing. Car is noticeably lower, but it's not completely slammed. I guess if I want to go down lower, I can, but I'll probably drive it around and see where it settles out and go from there. So if you attempt this install on your own, I wish you the best of luck.